Hello, colleagues. It's such a great pleasure to share my team's research into sustainable development and the electrification of transit at the International Congress of Art, Science, and Technology. Wonderful to be back in Brazil. This research was undertaken in collaboration with the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. And though there are many Canadian references, our literature review was global, and there's I think many points of relevance to people around the world in terms of the electrification of transit. I want to celebrate our team. OK University had students and faculty researchers, including health policy experts, urban planners, architects, transportation planners, and climate change scientists. Our colleagues at QTRIC brought their transit planning hats to the table and engineering skills, as did the University of Toronto. The United Nations has identified sustainability goals intended to address the climate crisis. Change in transportation practices are a significant feature in climate change mitigation. If achieved, ZEB impacts are far-reaching: reduction of emissions and particulates, improved quality of urban life through less pollution and noise, improved health of residents, more equitable and affordable reach and choice of transit, industry growth, and green job creation. And secondary benefits include densification in urban centers and cost reductions for the healthcare system. When we talk about ZEB, we need zero-emission buses, and this includes transit infrastructure, battery electric buses, and hydrogen fuel cell electric buses, plus hybrid diesel buses. A sustainable transportation system is one that is safe, affordable, accessible, efficient, resilient, and that contributes minimal emissions of carbon and other pollutants. This sustainable system requires creative thinking about a future framework that is within the realm of possibility, is desirable to its users, and addresses the important role of transportation in the sustainable city. We asked, what are the best practices, lessons learned, and indicators of success, as well as critical gaps in research, data, tools, and policy needed to affect environmental, economic, social equity, and health drivers, and support the implementation of zero-emission bus transit infrastructures. So our research team analyzed Canadian and international literature, governmental and academic and industry data sources, and sought and characterized analytics tools that could support analysis and implementation of ZEB. Our literature review used sector and thematic keywords to analyze approximately 600 academic publications and gray literature, including policy and consultants' reports. Our data survey was both Canadian and international, extracted from the literature and also from subject matter searches. And our tool survey included data gathering, analysis, simulation, and visualization tools, again extracted from literature review and from commercial and open source surveys. And we undertook participant research, 34 stakeholder interviews across Canada with transit authorities, municipalities, provincial and federal government, politicians, technology providers, urban transit and equity advocacy groups and associations, and infrastructure, energy, and electricity providers, funders, investors, boards of trade, consultants, academics, and staff from our collaborator, QTRIC. We held workshops for feedback and analysis, and the themes and content were extracted from the literature review and the participant research using in vivo analysis. So let's talk about the literature review. We created an interactive resource that provides thematic access to navigate the over 600 publications that were divided along 6 major axes implicated in definitions of sustainable transportation and sustainable design: environment, economic, social, equity, health, as well as intersectional themes. We also looked for, and by intersectional themes we mean where these cross over, we also looked for literature that spoke directly to the adoption of zero electric buses, whether policy, social attitudes, or investment, and barriers. We used in vivo to identify sub-themes within these major axes, and these indicated areas of concern, but also gaps and barriers to research or lack of interest, which drove those gaps. The literature review search indicated that themes like analytic, technology, and social, which included health and equity, appeared most frequently in abstracts and articles. Other significant themes in analytics technology literature were predictive and prescriptive, data insights, AI, spatial analytics, visual analytics and design, and data visualizations. Tools used IoT sensors analytics, and significant social themes were equity policy, gender and intersectional factors, equitable access, social benefit, social policy, sustainability, and transit policy. If we disaggregated health, it actually received less attention, with concerns including improved health policy, safety and health outcomes, health policy, air quality. Major themes in transportation systems were infrastructure, planning, transportation technologies, passenger adoption, and manufacturing. And articles that bore ZEB or EV, also so electric vehicles, and ZEB were often coupled. Relevancy focused on batteries, charging systems, adoption of ZEB, EV adoption, fossil fuel usage, electrification, and hydrogen. Environmental concerns included CO2 emissions, again, fossil fuel usage, GHG emissions, environmental sustainability. And the significant codes in economic were cost of power, economic efficacy, which was a trade-off often with environmental, growth and jobs, projections, economic projections, public transit, adoption and growth. So a very interesting set of themes. Slide 10 indicates the themes that preoccupied the individuals and groups we interviewed, and perhaps a little bit differently than the Lit Review, economic factors, transportation systems, and environmental factors loomed large. By mapping available data, gaps in the data that was available, and connecting these data with sustainable development goals, we hope to support data sharing and build a national and international argument for investment, implementation, and assessment. So some examples of data sources, and I should mention that we looked at data collection methods and types as well as equity issues, and we used GBA plus analysis to look at gender bias and other forms of bias potentially in data, and noted that. We did consider Canadian and international data sources. Some important examples are the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program, that is the main source of ambient air quality data in Canada. The Advanced Clear Transit Cost Assumptions and Data Sources from the California Air Resources Board, which models cost analysis and health impacts. Really, really great data surveys. The Alternate Fuels Data Center in the US, which supports fleets and analyzes their data. Proprietary data like Geotab, and the General Transit Feed Specification, GTFS, which differentiates it from a real-time extension, but it gives Canadian information on public transit schedules and GIS information. I mean, there's many other examples, the Open in Science Data Platform and Open Data Portal with access to environmental data that are global, the NAPS program, which is ambient air quality data in Canada, and the Origin Destination Survey, which has been carried on every 5 years since 1970, is a significant transportation study in the province of Quebec in Canada, for example, and it shows you really what passengers do, which is very helpful. So this is just a bit of a sampling, but there isn't really consistent data collection in the Canadian context. We also reviewed tools in the broadest sense that were needed for planning, implementation, and assessment. Municipal transit authorities need practical tools to identify and visualize changes in work process, labor skills, and transition requirements, to consider the number and costs of operators for ZEB implementation, given that more buses and shorter routes may be required, and to model all labor costs into an economic analysis of ZEB implementation. There's a need for contextual data analysis and visualization beyond the immediate environmental and cost analysis provided by current commercial systems, and visualization tools also can help decision makers see the interactive system as a whole, so they can identify and quantify the impacts of electrification across environmental, economic, and social factors. So, tools for data analysis are used in day-to-day operations, for example, by Siemens, and Sobral et al. And Nielsen et al. And Zhang et al. All demonstrated that these tools are essential because of the vast volumes of multi-source spatial and temporal data required to plan, implement, and monitor the electrification of transit. So we've certainly studied types of visualizations most effective in correlating multi-factors in space, and you're going to see some of our work later on in this presentation. And Thomas et al. Provided excellent work in terms of looking at particulates in terms of air pollution data through parallel coordinate visualizations. So there's lots of important work in this space. In fact, here are a few studies. So in Shenzhen, China, this is modeling total financial and ecological support of the government to replace all buses and rebuild infrastructure and charging facilities and transport systems. Great article, how a Chinese city turned all of its 16,000 buses electric, and they collected their data through a bus IC card and some GIS data. This is Zhang's study, and was able to correlate bus locations, passenger trips, and it's a very rich 2D picture of passenger flows and helps, of course, for decision-making and optimization purposes. This is a dashboard study, which is quite helpful, outlined by Reddy et al. In 2014, designing New York City subways. So key performance indicators are utilized to monitor overall route systems and performance and to achieve operational goals, and comparable to rider experience data for assessment. And in this example, this is a dashboard example from Winnipeg, Manitoba. So this looks at e-bus purchase cost compared to equipment life and discount rates per year, and looks at things like annual travel for bus, fuel consumption, fuel cost, infrastructure cost, and maintenance costs, and integration costs. Of course, the other factor is GHG emissions as a comparison to conventional diesel fuels. Before I move on to the analysis and more in-depth discussion of our conclusions, I want to share the interactive resource that we created. It coincides with our report. So you can explore all of the resources for each theme, beginning with the citations, i.e. the literature to review, with data and then tools that we felt were most critical. So in the dashboard, we highlight the references that we use in the report and that we think are the most critical for readers to explore. Literature is organized by sub-theme, and within these by years, using a bubble graph strategy. Data sources are treated the same way, starting with those that are actually referenced within the report that we developed. And then all data sources that we found in our search for data are represented through a radiograph by source with network connections around types of data, for example, city, region, or industry, or real-time data. Here, tools are represented, those that were cited within the report again, and then those that are in the larger survey. And we note a gap of a climate indicator tool that's needed. Also, tools to measure air pollution consistently are lacking. Now here we move on to all of the tools that we found organized by tool types. For example, there's many transportation systems tools, and also a subset that measures ZEB, capacity and performance. So we're moving on to our findings. Public transit really is the driver. What's important is that expanded transit use remains an overarching goal as it takes more personal vehicles off the road, including electric vehicles, and public transit reduces congestion, has a positive impact on GHG emissions, and fares finance transit. While the GHG reduction benefits of public transportation electrification are less than commercial fleets, it's important that public transit play a leadership role. But ZEB adoption is disruptive. New infrastructures are complex, implementation demands process and management changes that necessitate careful planning, and it's difficult for agencies to decide which technology to choose, and there's a lack of standardization of equipment. Yet ZEB adoption, whether battery electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell, is transformative, as we've discussed before, and it can result in long-term savings. So our argument is the need to integrate ZEB into long-term holistic transit planning. ZEB integration will be most successful when integrated within a planning process that includes rail, on-demand, last-mile services, and active transit to ensure equal and preferably better access. And it's a means to stabilize public transit as it recovers, at least in the North American context, over COVID-19, and to expand economic and cost-benefit analysis to include indirect savings from cleaner air and fewer emissions and the social benefits of expanding ridership. So in our study, we heard again and again that there are short-term barriers of capital expenses, and these must be addressed to allow long-term savings and operational cost savings. So it means assessing and monitoring life cycle costs, the return of investment of electrification, and a longer cycle of investment than the election cycle. Canada has put significant dollars on the table, but those will need to be matched over many years by both industry and future investors. There's a significant opportunity to integrate ZEB, electricity, and energy modernization. And both in our literature review and our interviews, we heard many times that we need a wells-to-wheels approach to address full-cycle environmental benefits, including electrical sources, batteries, materials, and garage construction. And there's a need to understand the battery life cycle and develop a cyclical economy for zero-emission buses. Of course, the choice of a ZEB bus, battery electric bus, or hydrogen depends in part on how clean electricity is and will be. And of course, there's a need to align grid upgrades and clean electricity investment, both public and private, with ZEB adoption. In Canada, hydrogen is an efficient alternative for cold climates. And it requires investment, though, in clean technology development and national codes and standards for hydrogen vehicles. So the disruption of ZEB and the need for holistic transit planning offers an opportunity for accessible public transit to support access to jobs, healthcare services, education, and to meet the diverse needs and travel patterns of a wide group of users. And ZEB pilots do best when focused on low-income, high-use populations and underserved neighborhoods through, for example, on-demand services. Ensuring accessibility for the disabled, for example, blind travelers challenged by silent buses, is also very important. This is an opportunity to set improved health goals, and the most polluted neighborhoods are those with heavy public transit and bus use. Exhaust pollutants from diesel engines, even low sulfur diesel, CO, NOx, HC, PM, and sulfur dioxide, cause childhood and adult cancer, respiratory diseases, asthma, strokes, heart disease, and dementia. And noise pollution impacts mental health and cardiovascular disease, the research shows. We can correlate particulate reduction and noise reduction goals with disease reduction targets and outcomes, and further calculate cost benefits to healthcare and future policy initiatives. And Indigenous communities in the Canadian context, but globally, lack basic transportation infrastructure. So Indigenous leaders in our country are very aware of emerging technologies and environmental benefits. There's an opportunity to invest in Indigenous communities' sustainable and green transit infrastructure in partnership with those very communities. One of the outcomes of our research was the apparent need to develop a sustainable transit planning index that can use data to plan, implement, and monitor environmental, economic, and social equity and health metrics. This slide is a summary of all of the factors, or many of them, impacting sustainable transportation planning that could inform a planning index using, of course, metrics relevant to these categories, whether they're environmental benefits, environmental in terms of geological and geographic damage reduction, reducing pollution, economic and environmental impacts such as energy consumption reduction, opportunities for jobs and growth, which are a key impact of electrification, equitable access, and of course health and safety. This slide gives a bit of a sense of the trade-offs in sustainability and economic factors in bus type purchase. For example, battery electric buses prices will decline, but they're high now. and the price of batteries are declining, but there's 50 to 100% GHG savings in adoption, and there's lower maintenance costs, and of course a concern is that these are emerging technologies, so sometimes the timeline of adoption is informed by waiting for the technology to be more mature. So we responded to the needs for a visualization tool or a set of tools in order to effectively analyze the implementation of sustainable electric buses. So we've created a series of prototypes that graphically represent comparative data using mapping visualizations to analyze and display sensor and tracking data collected through the deployment of e-buses. Our expert group of local Greater Toronto and Hamilton area transit agencies and other agencies across the country, and as well as technology providers, responded to our prototypes, providing feedback to improve them. This example is a bus bridging visualization, but the tool provides a different context, but it provides information on subway lines that may be affected in crises and requires bus bridging and a 3D image of a route in relation to density of the built space. We've created tools to graphically represent comparative data and use mapping visualizations to analyze sensor and tracking data collected through the deployment of e-buses. So this is a set of comparative visualizations for bus bridging, and again, it's a different context, but it's very relevant to look at e-bus implementation when you're considering routes and the impacts of the amount of battery capacity they have, for example. This example shows the ways that researchers and implementation teams can accurately track the progress impacts of e-bus implementation. So these are 2D visualizations integrated into maps, and this is a user-centric dashboard, again, to support different professionals who are overseeing the implementation of e-bus. So this is the design of local, regional, and national maps for all provinces and cities in Canada that currently have an electric bus demonstration running. So you can see different scales of implementation. And this is the first sketch of a user-centered dashboard to support implementation of electric buses. Feedback on the first iteration of the tool provided the team with a clear collection of features the tool needed to augment, and the addition of a color-coded route system is essential for the readability of the tool's map. Yeah, and here we see the inclusion of more comparative charts and graphs to help visualize the data. So here you see local, regional, and national maps, so the different scales representing all the provinces and cities in Canada that currently have an electric bus demonstration running. So you can do comparative analysis between those. These are more comparative charts and graphs in order to allow kind of more effective analysis of implementation. So now we're going to move to the actual functional prototype, which is a web-based interactive dashboard that brings all of that prior work together. And this research was undertaken by Val and led by Grace Ewan. So this is a national map with all the QTRIC member cities from which the user can choose. Originally, it is centered around a national map of Canada, and the map can move to and zoom in between different cities based on the user's selection. On-map visualizations have simulations of results for range analysis. So this is a planning tool, but it equally could be the actual data from the range. And the interaction between the graphs and the maps is implemented by animating bus icons that run on the bus routes. This is an animated chart that visualizes the GHG emission analysis results. So graphs are related to charging, recovery time, and energy consumption, and they're outlined with charging metrics. And here's another approach to relating data on charging, recovery time, and energy consumption So looking at more of a bar graph strategy. So these are electricity cost estimates, and you can see that we've created different icons in order to represent different types of buses. So it's easier for the user to understand the impacts of, for example, battery size and range. So we started with the big picture around sustainable transit development and our comparative research, and then we brought you through to a natural tool that we created that is being used by QTRIC in order to support their evaluation of the implementation of buses, looking at environmental, economic, and accessibility factors. Thank you for listening.